difference between Roosevelt and Truman, his successor, is enormous. Roosevelt, in his first inauguration, says, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself."
We have to fear is fear itself.
Then comes Harry Truman. There is a power, a monolithic power in the world today. That power is communism, forever on the march. And he's frightening us about this terrible enemy called Russia and communism. Just saw the difference. It was night and day, night and day. Roosevelt hit the affirmative side and swept the nation. Truman got us deeper and deeper into great trouble and stirred the pot, and out of the pot comes McCarthy. Out of it comes the House Un-American Activities Committee. Out of it comes, "You're not a good American. You were seen reading a book without moving your lips. That is a sure sign of a communist." And I speak as a U.S. Senator. That was the game.
This, our country and all its people, could be in danger of nuclear attack. In minutes by enemy missiles, in hours by enemy aircraft. Our cities, our farms, our factories.
Well, I think I saw through the myths of the Cold War almost from the beginning.
So as I mentioned before, when Dan joins Rand Corporation and becomes an active nuclear war planner, he is a thoroughgoing Cold Warrior hawk. He believes what Gore Vidal was ascribing to Truman and all the Cold War mythology. He believes completely. Dan was at MIT on his path, people thought, to a Nobel Prize in economics. He actually leaves to go join the Marine Corps. He just thought it was his duty to defend America from communism. This is just after the Korean War he joins, gets sent actually to the Middle East. He starts, this is where he talks about the missile gap. This is the beginning of the unraveling of the Cold War mythology for him. When he realizes that they've been lying, that in fact there was a missile gap, but the missile gap was in favor of the United States, not the other way around. It's the beginning of a series of revelations for him, but it takes a long time before he really sees through the Cold War. In fact, when he goes to Vietnam, he's commissioned partly by Clifford Clark, who was became defense secretary, and McNamara before that, to do the report on Vietnam, which ends up being what's called the Pentagon Papers. He's still a hawk. He goes to Vietnam trying to figure out how to save the United States from this disaster. But in the course of studying Vietnam and what led into the war and the numbers of lies that led to the Vietnam War, not the least of which, I don't know if younger people know the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where the U.S. said this American boat had been blown up by the North Vietnamese, when in fact it wasn't. I mean, that's part of the whole thing that Dan starts to realize. And in the film, through Dan, we realize that every war the United States has been in, at the very least since World War II, but there's any number of lies, especially in terms of the Manhattan Project during World War II. Dan starts to realize it's everything he believed, as he said, was a delusion, very profitable delusion. After the releases the Pentagon Papers, he's arrested, his trial under the Espionage Act, and he's only gets out because, if it's a funny story, Barbara Streisand holds a fundraising party for him. And because of that, he's able to carry on his legal defense for another 2-3 months. And by the end of that 3 months, John Dean, who was Nixon's lawyer, spills the beans on the breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. Same plumbers that break into the Watergate Hotel. And when the judge finds that out, he kicks the case. It's even then, he's still pretty much a cold warrior. But he starts to read. He reads Chomsky, he reads Zinn, and he starts to put the pieces together in a way that it's not just what he says in Doomsday Machine, institutional madness, which is the term he uses many times. He starts to get this is beyond an issue of madness, even though it's mad. But why is there institutional madness? And he starts to realize how much of this is baked into what Vidal said there, the militarization of the US economy. And he reads another book that was very influential with him, and this is in the early 90s. And I'm right now preoccupied with this right now because I'm working on this in the film. We're working on this section of the Cold War. That Kofsky book really dropped the coin for him, which was this architecture of the threat of the Soviet Union was not a misunderstanding on the part of the Truman administration, but was a deliberate, calculated lie. That the inner circle around Truman, and this include particularly someone like Nimitz, who helps write this extremely important document, which I doubt too many people here have heard of. Let me just ask for the sake of argument. NSC 68, anybody knows what that is? There, the two people that are studying this stuff. This was the framework for the Cold War. The Soviet Union is this evil force. They're going to invade Western Europe. They're going to attack the United States. And we need to have this massive buildup, starting with expanding and developing the nuclear weapons. And the existential threat of the bomb is the rationale for the whole military industrial complex and all the billions and trillions that gets spent afterwards. And obviously the reason why all this matters so much is because that fabric of lies is what still is governing not just US, but Canadian. I have to keep reminding myself I'm so involved in this US stuff. The Canadian posture is mostly in line with the US, although we did, I was just mentioning, I'm sorry, I forget your name. Art? Yeah. One of the things at the end of the film there, in terms of what could be done to get back into the anti-ballistic missile treaty or renegotiate a new one that was abrogated by the Bush administration, one of the first things they did after 9/11, 9/11 wasn't just the rationale for the invasion of Iraq. 9/11 was the rationale for abrogating the ABM Treaty, which had been a wet dream of the neoconservatives right from the early 90s. Why did they want to get rid of the ABM Treaty? Anti-ballistic missile treaty was the most rational thing. It actually begins under Johnson, the planning to have an ABM treaty. Anti-ballistic missiles sound great. They're there to defend us against a nuclear attack, if only they worked. Well, first of all, they don't work because it's an impossible thing. If you have thousands of things coming in and thousands of decoys, an ABM system simply is ineffective. But what is it effective for? An ABM system is great if you launch a first strike, knock out as much of the weaponry of the Russians, or it could be the Chinese, but it's mostly the thinking was Russia. Then the second strike, maybe an ABM system, maybe might have some effect on the second strike coming back. So it's actually a first strike weapon. It's not defensive. Well, they realized this in 72, and Nixon and Brezhnev signed a treaty to limit the development of ABM systems because they realized how destabilizing it was. But how much does an ABM system cost? How long is a piece of string? It costs whatever you can bloody well get away with. It's like, how much can you scare everybody is how much you can spend on an ABM system. So the neocons who just want military budgets without end wanted to get rid of the ABM treaty, and they did it in 72. So what happened in Canada 6 months ago? Canada always supported the ABM treaty and was against the abrogation of it. And now, what is it, 6, 7, 8 months ago? This government, liberal government, essentially has now pledged $40 billion, I think, over the next 20 years, which is to get essentially now buy into the ABM system, something we know is BS. It even includes not just over the horizon radar, but space-based radar, which is essentially the weaponization of space, something Canada has supposedly always been against. And now we're in. And what does it do for you? Like, let's say you know something's coming in a minute earlier, 5 minutes earlier. What are you going to do about it? One, you still don't know if it's real. Yeah. But, you know, some guy, like one guy had me going on an airplane once. He was in uniform. I asked, what do you do? And he says, I go around to bases and I train people what to do if there's a nuclear attack. You know, and he says, you know, you put your head between your legs, you lean down and you kiss your ass goodbye. He had me going right up to kiss your ass goodbye. I mean, so what if you know a little bit sooner? It makes no difference. Just that if it is a real first strike and it knocks out all these North American cities, you're obviously going to, shouldn't be, but they're going to strike back against Russia with the American submarine fleet. So it makes no difference if you know. What are you going to tell people 5 minutes earlier to get into their basement, which is pointless. And then once the first strike is probably enough to begin a nuclear winter. But a second strike guarantees you the nuclear winter. So it is a point. Why are we doing it? Well, if you want to keep, as I'm talking now Canadians, if you want to keep selling stuff into the American military industrial complex, you want to keep selling stuff into the nuclear complex, and we do all of that, you better go along with the thinking, the strategy, the madness. So Dan starts to realize, to a large extent through Kofsky's book, and if you want, I actually have some quotes, which I can read you, but I'll see how interested everybody is in that. How conscious and deliberate the lying was. I'll read you just some of this because it's incredible. So now we're going back into 1947, 48. And this is one of the things that really clicked for Ellsberg. And it's why he says that the Cold War was essentially a subsidy for the American aerospace industry. So here's a quote from Robert E. Gross, 1945, January, president of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, which had done this massive build out during the war. Now the war is over. Now what? So he says in 1945, personally, I feel it is encouraging. This is talk in Washington about some kind of support for them. But I must point out that much of this depends on the kind of peace we achieve. This is in 45. If we have a true and lasting peace, obviously the demand for military airplanes will be limited. On the other hand, if we have an armed truce, and it begins to look as though this may be the case, the demand for military airplanes might be very considerable. This is the beginning of how they get to the need for the Cold War existential threat, because it wasn't that they didn't consider the Soviet Union a threat, and it was a threat. Politically, ideologically, whatever you think of the Soviet Union, it represented a socialist vision for most of the world. In 1945, 46, people didn't know much of what Stalin had done inside the Soviet Union in terms of repression. There were liberation marches throughout Europe. They had Stalin's photograph everywhere. In Greece, which he mentions, but many countries, support for the Soviet Union and and this is most important, the domestic communist movement in Europe, who were mostly the leaders of the partisan struggle, was high. They were looking at a world that wasn't so eager to get into this Western American-controlled capitalist world. There was, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That was the real problem. So in that sense, the Soviet Union was a threat, but it was not a military threat. There was no plan or prospect for the Soviet Union to march into Western Europe, and there was certainly no plan to use nuclear weapons as a first strike against the United States. And they knew it, but they told the world, and especially they told the American people, that there was such a threat. And they used it in two ways. They used it to justify the nuclear weapons build out, they used it to justify the military industrial complex build out, and they used it to suppress the domestic left in the United States. And that's where you get then McCarthyism, you get House of American Un-American Activities Committee, and what do? They purge the government of anyone who's at all progressive. They purge unions, which was maybe the most important target for them. And of course, what's well known is they purge Hollywood. Here's a quote from, this is from the minutes of the Air Coordinating Committee, February 1947. These are the minutes of the meeting. Mr. Norton, who's at the meeting, feels that the real heart of the question is the survival of the U.S. aircraft manufacturing industry, particularly in the next 6 months to a year. It raises the question, how much of a subsidy must be forthcoming? Emergency legislation may be necessary in order to maintain minimum production levels. So there's a complex of things all happening at the same time. The Republicans and the sections of capital the Republicans represent are very focused on domestic politics. Most importantly, they want to smash the unions. In 1946, there's more strikes in the United States than any year before or after. It is one of the high peaks of workers' militancy in the United States. All these soldiers come back from war and say, we're fighting and dying for democracy. How about we have some? And people around the world were saying things like that. So there was a tremendous height of working class activity. So they passed this Taft-Hartley Bill, which is to make it much harder to organize unions. Now, Truman knew, because Henry Wallace, the vice president Fidel talks about, is very progressive. And in today's terms, Henry Wallace, the vice president, would have been to the left of Bernie Sanders. And that's not an exaggeration. And he's the vice president. But there's a coup in the Democratic Party convention in, I guess it's 45. And they dump Wallace and bring in Truman to please the far right of the Democratic Party. Wallace runs for president on an independent ticket in 48, and he's doing really well. In fact, he wins New York. So Truman does two things. He tries to outflank Wallace on the left, so he vetoes Taft-Hartley Bill, the anti-labor legislation, knowing his veto is going to get overridden in Congress. So he knows his veto is not going anywhere. And he advocates Medicare for all. Maybe he wanted it, I don't know, but he also knew that Congress was going to veto it. So then and it may be that he did this under pressure from Hoover, but he does what Fidel talked about. He passes the Loyal DeO. And this is the thing where they're going to get rid of every progressive they can find in the country. In fact, Hoover starts creating a list of communist, progressive, socialist, leftists, and that's a list for people to be arrested if there's ever a real serious national emergency. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they start finding where everybody on that list is. This isn't, 1962. They're ready to round up all these people. All right, so I'll just conclude this point quickly, and then we can see where you want to go. What Dan started to realize later, and is that this decision, and again, ask me if you want, but the question is, why did they build a nuclear weapon when they knew the Germans didn't have one? Why do they risk a test that they actually think has a chance of atmospheric ignition, setting the entire atmosphere on fire? Everyone's here seen Oppenheimer, I assume, yeah? No? And there's a scene in it where he says, what's the risk of atmospheric ignition? And Very low, says Oppenheimer. And General Gross says, but not zero. He says, no, I can't give you zero. Well, then why risk atmospheric ignition when you know the Germans don't have a bomb? Because the bomb just would give the US such leverage in the post-World War II world. They knew that it wasn't because they needed it against Japan. It's fairly accepted now. There's some debate. There are many reasons for dropping the bomb on Japan, but the primary reason was to tell the world, we have it and you don't. Especially tell the Soviet Union, we have it and you don't. Even though they were getting all kinds of warnings from scientists and Einstein and all kinds of people, were saying it's only a matter of time till the Soviet Union has it and there's going to be a nuclear arms race. They don't mind that. God, look at the money that can be made in a nuclear arms race. So the point here is that it's baked into the politics and culture of the United States right from the American Civil War. JP Morgan Bank comes into being by loaning money to the Union Army, selling government bonds, making money on the bonds, and then selling arms. And this actually became a scandal afterwards because Morgan was buying rifles for $2.25 and then selling them to the Union Army for $22. I mean, this goes back to the beginning of American industrialization, that big banks, financialization, and militarization is at the foundations of the US economy and politics and political culture. And it's ours too, because we ride the American gravy train. You know, we can sound self-righteous as Canadians, and we feel like, oh, we're not really the bad guys. But a significant part of our economy is, and it's very interesting that one of the guys that owns one of the most significant aerospace defense contractor companies is also one of the main shareholders of Suncor. I mean, the combination of people in Canada involved in fossil fuel, arms manufacturing, and of course, the big banks. So we're supposed to end at 6:30. We can go to 7, you said, if people want to. Yeah, I'll go to questions in 1 minute. So the objective of the film is two things. One, to undo this Cold War assumptions that they're out to get us, because the possibility of any first strike launched against North America is just ridiculous. It would be the end of the world, and everybody knows it. We're defending, the US and us as part of that, defending ourselves against a non-existent threat. And the most dangerous part of that is launch on warning and the ICBMs, which they have no idea whether a strike coming in is actually a strike, and they're all going to already launch a counterstrike with subs, with everything. And if they do, it's the end. And one of the things Dan discovered, which I'm sure is still the case, they don't just hit Russia. In the war plans Dan's talking about, they hit every major city in China, even if China wasn't involved. That was the plan. And certainly now it would be the plan. You take out every city in Russia and China, even if there's never a counterstrike this way, it's the end of life as we know it because of nuclear winter. So we want to undo the Cold War thinking. We want to scare the shit out of people about the current threat. But there are some concrete things that can be done to at least reduce risk. Most important is get rid of launch on warning, phase out ICBMs, and get back into an ABM treaty. And then we've got to deal with AI.